Good morning, good evening, good afternoon, and remember, context is everything. Media Network founder and CEO John Michael is reading a textbook, cover to cover. Today, we read about Chapter 34, Section 2. We're almost done with this book, folks. Keep your ears open for next level content. Here we go. Chapter 34, Section 2, From Revolution to Reform in China. Setting the scene. No sunglasses today. On October 1st, 1999, China celebrated an important anniversary. Exactly 50 years earlier, in 1949, communist leader Mao Zedong had announced the birth of the People's Republic of China. He pledged to build a new China, independent, prosperous, and strong. Under Mao, China experienced a revolution that ranks with Russia as one of the major social transformations of the 90s. Communist control of China, new heading. After World War II, civil war resumed between Mao Zedong communist forces and Jiang Zeishi's nationalists. Battles raged until Mao's forces swept to victory and set up the People's Republic of China. Jiang Zeisha and his supporters fled to the island of Taiwan. After decades of struggle, China has finally united with the communists in control. Reasons for victory. In the communists' triumph, for a number of reasons, Mao won the support of China's huge peasant population. Peasants had long suffered from brutal landlords and crushing taxes. The communists pledged to redistribute land to poor peasants and end oppression by landlords. Additionally, many women backed Mao's forces. The nationalists had made little effort to improve their harsh lives. Women were still seen as inferior to men and often were cruelly mistreated. The communists rejected the inequalities of old Confucian order. To point out this break with tradition, Mao said, "Women hold up half the sky." Mao's armies outfought Jiang's, and while support for communists grew, the nationalists lost popularity. To point out the break to accommodate women's rights, Mao, the largest genocidal murderer of the 20th century, he said, and I quote, "Women hold up half the sky." And I think that we can say, since he was responsible for the most deaths in the 20th century, which is probably the century with the most deaths in history, so the individual one man most responsible for deaths in humankind, he said, and I quote, "Women hold up half the sky," which won him support from women. Mao's armies outfought Jiang's, and while support for the communists grew, the nationalists lost popularity. Many educated Chinese saw Jiang's government as morally and politically bankrupt. They hoped that the communists would build a new China and end foreign domination. Reorganizing the economy. Once in power, communists set out to turn China from a backward peasant society into a modern industrialized nation. To build socialism and repair the economy, China nationalized all business. The government also drew up a 5-year plan to develop agriculture and heavy industry. With Soviet help, the Chinese built hydroelectric plants, railroads, and canals. To boost agriculture, Mao distributed land to peasants. Then he called on collectivization, or pooling of peasants' land and labor in an attempt to increase efficiency. How bizarre. This guy has the gall to say women hold up half the sky in order to pander to women in support. And then he murders the most people in the 20th century. I think, 90 million that he's responsible for the deaths of, this Mao guy? I think that's pretty funny because he's pandering with this sort of inclusive language, but he's also the greatest murderer the world has ever seen. I think that's funny. Not because of everyone dying, but I think it's funny because people fall for it. And I don't think it's funny, but I do think that it is reminiscent of what we see, maybe on a lesser scale today, but certainly it's a pandering, and it's a political pandering that we see every day. Remolding society. Like Lenin in the Soviet Union, Mao Zedong built a one-party totalitarian state, with the Communist Party supreme. Communist ideology replaced Confucian beliefs and traditional religion. The government attacked crime and corruption. It did away with the old landlord business classes. In their place, peasants and workers were honored as builders of a new China. Many thousands of landlords and middle-class people were beaten and killed. The official justified the attack by saying, "The freedom we uphold is not the same as that based on the type of democracy advocated by the bourgeoisie. We, on the contrary, hold that there must be democratic liberties among the people, but that no freedom should be extended to counter-revolutionaries. For them, we have only dictatorship." Lu Tingyi, a speech delivered in May of 1956, 7 years after the founding of the PRC, People's Republic. To increase literacy, the government amplified Chinese characters, simplified Chinese characters, making it easier to learn and read to write. Schools were open for young and old. Reading and writing were mixed in political education. Students learned to praise the great helmsman, Mao Zedong, who could do no wrong. The communists also sent healthcare workers to remote rural areas. Although many of these barefoot doctors had limited training, they did help reduce disease and better hygiene. Changes for women. Under China's new constitution, women won equality under the law. They were expected to work alongside men in fields and factories. State-run nurseries were set up to care for the children. These changes weakened the old ideal of the extended family dominated by oldest male. In China, cities, as elsewhere in the developing world, the nuclear family became increasingly common. What did they just say? In the new constitution, women won equality under the law. They were expected to work alongside men in the fields and factories. If you don't find that funny, because they're not acknowledging that that is not a good form of equality, then I disagree.
I disagree.
What's up, buddy? Let's see, where am I? Where are we? Although Chinese women made real progress, they did not enjoy full equality. Only a few won promotion to top in government and industry. Women were paid less than men for the same work. Also, after working at paid jobs, they still were responsible for cleaning, cooking, and childcare. That's not equal. I just think it's funny that they're not acknowledging the contradiction, the hypocrisy in that statement. This is almost like it's trying to make China look good. It's bizarre. This is honestly written in strange language. Economic disaster, new heading. Although some reformers did result in more access to education and greater equality, people in China paid heavy costs for Mao's programs. During the 1950s and 1960s, two efforts in particular led to economic disaster and tremendous loss of life. The Great Leap Forward. In 1958, Mao launched a program known as the Great Leap Forward. He urged people to make superhuman effort to increase farm and industrial output. In an attempt to make agriculture more efficient, he created communes. A typical commune included several villages, thousands of acres of land, and up to 25,000 people. It had its own schools, factories, housing, and dining halls. Each commune had production quotas. Communes also mobilized labor brigades to build dams and irrigation systems. Rural communities set up backyard industries to produce steel and other products. The Great Leap Forward was a dismal failure. Backyard industries turned out low-quality, useless goods. The common system slowed food output. Bad weather and declining food production added to the problem and led to a terrible famine. Between 1959 and 1961, up to 30 million Chinese were thought to have starved to death. In response, China turned to more moderate policies. Cultural Revolution. China slowly recovered from the Great Leap Forward. Then in 1966, Mao launched the Great Proletarian Cultural Revolution. Its goal was to purge China of bourgeoisie, or non-revolutionary tendencies. Bourgeois, rather. He urged young Chinese to experience revolution firsthand, as his generation did. In response, teenagers formed bands of Red Guards, waving copies of literal Red Book of Mao's sayings. A picture of the Little Red Book in the hands of the youth. There you are. Little Red Book in the hands of the youth. Cultural Revolution convulsed China. What? Schools and factories closed and economy slowed, and civil war threatened. Finally, Mao had the army restore order. Many Red Guards were sent to work on communes. They became lost generation, undereducated and cut off from normal life and careers. In the end, many became disillusioned with communism. China and the Cold War. New heading. The communist victory over the nationalists dominated the Cold War in 1959. After Jiang Zeshi fled to Taiwan, the United States continued support the nationalist government. The United States refused to recognize the People's Republic of China, which it saw as aggressive communist power and a threat to all of Asia. Relations with the United States. For years, the United States tried to isolate China. In 1971, however, China won admission to the United Nations. A year later, the United States President, Richard Nixon, visited Mao in Beijing. Slowly, relationships improved. Finally, in 1979, the United States set up a formal diplomatic relationship with China, split with the Soviet Union. China and the Soviet Union were uneasy allies in the 1950s. Stalin sent economic aid and technical experts to help China modernize, but he and Mao disagreed on many issues. Mao had adopted Marxism to Chinese conditions. Marx had predicted that the industrial working class, the proletariat, would lead the revolution. Because China had little industry, however, Mao's revolution relied on peasants rather than factory workers. Stalin rejected Mao's view. Mao, in turn, thought the Soviets were too conservative and accused them of being too willing to coexist with capitalist powers. China and the Soviet Union also competed for influence in developing nations. In addition, border disputes triggered tensions between the two. By 1960, border clashes and disputes over ideology led the Soviets to withdraw aid and advisors from China. Well, they're back together now. 2023, August. They made up. They made up 63 years later. Kind of all comes full circle, doesn't it? Comes full circle. They're back. Chinese and Russians. We love it. Right? Don't we? Do we? Reform and repression. New heading. Mao Zedong died in 1976. Despite disastrous mistakes, many still saw him as a revolutionary hero who had restored order, ending foreign domination, and made China a world power once again. After Mao, more moderate leaders controlled China. By 1981, Deng Xiaoping set up the China on a new path. Deng was a practical reformer, more interested in raising output than political purity. "I do not care if a cat is black or white," he declared, "as long as it catches mice." Economic reforms. Deng backed the program called the Four Modernizations, which emphasized agriculture, industry, science, and defense. As part of his plan, Deng introduced economic reforms, including some private ownership and property and free market policies. In agriculture, the responsibility system replaced the communes. Peasant families were allotted plots of farmland. The government took a share of their crops, but the family would sell the rest on the free market. Entrepreneurs were allowed to set up their own businesses. Managers of state-run factories were even given more freedom, but were expected to make their plants more efficient. Deng welcomed foreign capital and technology. Investors from Japan, Hong Kong, Taiwan, and the West organized joint ventures with China, in which foreign companies would organize a business with Chinese firms, with profits shared by both participants. The government also set up special enterprise zones where foreigners could own and operate industries. Deng's reforms brought a surge of growth and better standard of living for some Chinese. They were soon buying motor scooters, televisions, and refrigerators. On the downside, crime and corruption grew. Inequalities increased as new wealthy class emerged. An economic gap also grew between poor and rural farmers in the interior and city dwellers on the coasts who were exposed to Western influences. Tiananmen Square massacre. By the late 1980s, some Chinese were demanding greater political freedom as well as economic reform. In Beijing and other cities, students, workers, and other supporters of democratic movements like those sweeping Eastern Europe. Deng, however, would not talk about political reform. In May 1989, tens of thousands of demonstrators occupied Tiananmen Square. They raised banners calling for democracy and brought a huge plaster statue called the Goddess of Democracy and Freedom. When the demonstrators refused to disperse, the government sent in troops and tanks. Thousands of demonstrators were killed and wounded. Wow, killed or wounded. Many others were arrested and tortured. Some were put to death. The crackdown showed that China's communist leaders were determined to maintain control. To them, order was more important than political freedom. During the 1990s, efforts to persuade China to end human rights violations had limited effects. Challenges today. New heading. By the mid-1990s, China was a major industrial power. Its economy ranked among the fastest growing in the world, and it was building major trade ties with countries worldwide. Yet, even as economic gains continued, the nation faced many unresolved issues. Population growth posed a challenge for the future. Since 1949, China's population was more than doubled, to more than 1.2 billion. More than that now. Such rapid growth strained the economy, and in the 1980s, the government established one child per family policy. Not good. Parents who had only one child were given rewards such as better housing and improved medical benefits. Those who had more children faced fines and other penalties. Did they even have a choice? I'm pretty sure that there was a lot of, terminations. The campaign to slow the birth rate worked better in cities than in rural areas. Farm families who wanted children to work the land often paid fines rather than obey the policy. The one-child policy had tragic effects on the country that still valued boys over girls. Female infanticide, or killing of girl babies, increased despite efforts to prevent it. Economic and political issues. After Deng Xiaoping died in 1997, Jiang Zemin emerged as Chinese leader. He continued Deng's economic reforms and had to grapple with the same problems of Deng. Many state-run industries were inefficient but had to be closed without risking high unemployment and economic chaos. They could not be closed without risking high unemployment and economic chaos. Cities overflowed with millions of peasants who poured in seeking new opportunities. Inequalities between rich and poor and between urban and rural Chinese continued to grow. Across China, communist ideology was weakened. From party officials on down, people were more interested in profits than in socialism. Corruption was a growing problem. The government made some effort to crack down on corruption and other criminal activity. Human rights issues. The Communist Party maintained its monopoly on power and continued to jail critics. Its human rights abuses, however, brought strong pressures from trading partners such as the United States. Advocates on Western-style human rights did not focus on the suppression of dissent in China. Some asserted that China used prison labor to produce cheap export goods. Others charged China with imperialistic tyranny in Tibet, where their indigenous culture had been swamped by Chinese immigrants and military suppression of the Tibetan form of Buddhism. At the end of the 1990s, the Chinese government had also cracked down on a new Chinese version of Buddhism, the Falun Gong sect, which claimed millions of members. Political dissent, human rights advocates, and spokespeople for oppressed Tibet, such as Tibet's exiled religious leader, the Dalai Lama, found widespread support in Europe and the United States, until he sucked that kid's tongue. I don't support him anymore. China replied to the charges from the West by declaring that outsiders had no right to tell the Chinese leaders how to run their own domestic affairs. Chinese leaders also denied the right of the West to impose Western standards of human rights on other cultures. Thank you for listening. My name is John Michael at the Context is Everything Media Network, and thank you all 64 subscribers. I do appreciate it, and I'm not looking because I'm looking for a sticky note in my bag. Here it is. And I'd just like to say you get a thumbs up for 65 subscribers. Today, this. Thank you. God bless. Goodbye.